Ready? Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Laura Taylor. I run the bookstore here at Oxford Exchange. I'm absolutely thrilled for the first time to be partnering with the Florida House in DC. So they run a quarterly book club. And tonight we actually have a wonderful event that will be in person as well as on Zoom. And we will be talking with David Powell, who will be discussing 90 Miles and a Lifetime Away. So enjoy, everyone. Thanks so much. Please email us. We do have the book available online for purchase. And please listen, we will be also posting this on Instagram Live. So welcome, David.
Thank
welcome,
you, Laura.
Florida House.
Thank you.
I'm Suzanne Clemens. I'm chairman of the Board of Trustees of Florida House on Capitol Hill, and I am a part-time Tampa resident. As Laura said, this is the first time we've hosted on Zoom and in person. At Florida House, we champion, celebrate, and connect everything about Florida. And of course, if you want to get the Christmas spirit, you need to come down to Oxford Exchange because they are ready, and it's just a wonderful independent bookstore. And we appreciate their hospitality. I'm delighted now to welcome Mary B. Bout, a Florida House trustee from Tallahassee, and we do have a number of trustees here from around the state. And she's going to lead the discussion. And David, I loved your book. I was in the second grade when my Cuban friends came to Florida, my little town of Sebring, and I've thought about them and how brave they were. But we were very welcoming, and we'd go to these wonderful birthday parties where we'd never seen a piñata. And they just did so much for my little community. So welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Hello, we are so excited to have David Powell with us here in Tampa, and both of us live in Tallahassee. We drove down this morning, and we are really happy to be here to talk to y'all about his wonderful book. So David, I'll give you a little bit of a background to introduce him, our author. I need to turn it on, I guess. Hope you all can hear me now. So David was originally born in Texas. He's a Texan. He went to the University of Texas. He went to Columbia University School of Journalism in New York City. And then he worked for 10 years with the Associated Press in Florida. He came to Miami, and then he went to Tallahassee, he was in the Tallahassee Bureau, and then he attended Florida State University School of Law, College of Law, and then he had a wonderful legal career for about 30 years. So, David, I would really like to turn this over to you at this point and ask my first question, which is, how did this project evolve? So he's had a wonderful 2 careers in journalism and law, and I want to ask you, how did this whole project begin?
Well, thank you, Mary, and thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks to Oxford Exchange and Florida House in Washington for being our host tonight. I've been looking forward to this for some time now. The idea for the book actually came in the course of a conversation that my wife and I were having with some friends back in 2011. And for reasons I still can't explain, we were talking about someone who was a Cuban American, and I just, out of my mouth, I just said, isn't it amazing how many people we know who have that story? And when you really talk to them about their lives, the stories they tell about what Cuba was like, how they came to be here, what happened after they got here, those stories are always great. And somebody could take those and put those into an oral history book like Studs Terkel used to do. And my wife looked at me and she said, well, David, you should write that book. And so I put it off for a while, but eventually I decided it was something I wanted to do more than practice law. And so I worked on it for quite a few years. And I must say it was really one of the most satisfying professional experiences I've ever had.
Several of us have read the book, and he has 54 narrators. And so in the very beginning of the book, if you all haven't read it, I encourage you to go pick it up and look at the very beginning. It's very helpful. He lists the narrators in alphabetical order, and he talks about where in the world they live. And they're all over the United States. And his story is really a story about Florida, of course, but about the United States. It's really a story about the world. The book will take you all over the world. However, here at Florida House, who are really interested in the impact of Florida and all things Florida and how this whole story really affected Florida. So I want to ask you, you get this idea, the wife says to pursue it. How did you find the narrators?
Well, I started with friends, and then friends of friends, and then friends of friends of friends. It became almost a literary Ponzi scheme. Although I delivered a book. And it got so attenuated that there's one woman in the book who's got a unique story I never thought I would get. Her name is Paulina Garcia Horta, and she came over in the boat lift from Camarioca in 1965. Most of us didn't know there was one, but there was one. Only 5,000 people came over. And out of the 600,000 in the first 15 years after Castro took power, there were only 5,000 that had this story. And I thought, I'll never find anybody who's got that story. And lo and behold, I came across her. She told the story. She was the friend of a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend of my wife. So that shows you how attenuated it was. But that said, I did have a long list of criteria for the narrators that I wanted to get. People from Havana, people from elsewhere in Cuba, people who settled in Miami, people who settled elsewhere, people who came in the first wave, people who came in the second, men, women. I mean, you can see how that would have played out. And so as I was going through interviewing people, I was keeping track of how many of those criteria I was able to match up people with.
So now I want to ask you, how many interviews did you conduct?
54.
And so just 54, so all 54 down.
54, the people that I interviewed are in the book. And that
Okay,
was the
No,
commitment that I made to myself when I started.
okay, I wasn't sure about that. And then how many hours of interviews do you think you chronicled?
Well, each interview was 2 hours in length. I mean, these were really exhaustive interviews, and people kind of came out of it just emotionally wrung out. Many of them did, because it was the most traumatic experience of their lives in many cases. But it was 2 hours apiece, and there were a number of people I interviewed twice because there were things I wanted to follow up on. So I don't know how many hours that adds up to, but it was a lot.
And then how many years did it take you to do your interviews?
Well, I started interviewing in November of 2016, and I finished in February of 2020. And I had preparatory work on the front end, and I had editorial work on the back end. So the whole project was probably 7 years in all.
Okay, so for those of you who haven't read the book, it's organized by topic, which is really quite interesting. And so the interviews are not complete. So for example, he'll pick a topic and then will give you excerpts from, maybe a dozen people on a particular topic. And then he'll move to another chapter, which addresses another topic. And then you might find this person again. I mean, as a reader, I think you become very engaged with these stories. And you're like, oh yes, I remember the story. I want to hear more about it. Actually, after reading the book, it made me want to read the entire world histories. So one question I would like you to answer for the crowd, I know this because I've read the book, but where is your material now? You might want to tell people.
The University of Miami's Cuban Heritage Collection, which is probably the foremost archive of its type in this country, acquiring all my interview recordings, transcripts, work papers, photographs. I mean, the whole kit and caboodle, my books, everything. They've got it all, and they're in the process of archiving it. And I'm expecting them to put the transcripts online pretty soon, because the idea that we both had was it ultimately could make the transcripts online a supplement to the book.
Yes, and then I assume they would be digitized. So if you wanted, for instance, just to pull up every reference to Havana online, you would be able to do that, or
I assume so, but I haven't
We don't
discussed
know
that.
yet.
I haven't discussed that point with them.
we'll find out about that. But why don't you tell the audience what the chapter titles are and talk to us about how you decided to segregate these stories, because that would have been a challenge, I think.
When I first started, I decided to come up with a topic outline of the chapters that I wanted in the book, because I figured that was the clearest way to determine the narrative arc that I wanted the book to have. And so the first chapter was home, meaning Cuba, what my narrators remembered about Cuba when they lived there. The last chapter is home, meaning the United States and what their lives are like here now. And so in between, there are chapters dealing with the coup by which democratic government was overthrown in Cuba in 1952, and then the insurrection led by Fidel Castro, and what happened when he took power, and how people started to leave in the first wave, what happened after they got here, how people began to leave in the second wave in 1965, how that many of them came here on the freedom flights, and then how they ultimately adjusted to life in this country, and then their reflections on what it means to be an American.
So I want to ask you in all of this process, if you could give us a couple of examples of tidbits and facts that you learned that really surprised you. Because you were in Miami, you kind of were a part of the story yourself, just living in Miami at the time or closely to it. So what surprised you? What stories really caught your attention?
I discovered so much from my interviews that I never knew about. And I don't know how many people knew about. One story that I'll tell you comes from Jose Valiente of Tampa, who's here tonight. There he is, my narrator, Jose. One of the stories that Jose tells in the book is about Cuban loans. Those were loans made by the United States government to Cuban refugee young people based on need, and they used those loans to get a higher education. The loans for an undergraduate, there was a maximum of $1,000 a year, which doesn't sound like much today, but in the 1960s and 1970s, that would pay pretty much full freight at many public universities. I mean, I remember that was what I paid where I went to a public university. And I know that got Jose to the University of South Florida, which he talks about in the book. And of course, they repaid the loans. They had a very low default rate. And so that was one thing I didn't really fully appreciate, how many people in the Cuban American community in this country got a higher education or a professional school education in medicine or law with a loan from American taxpayers. It's one of the smartest things our government did. I looked all over for a cost benefit analysis to see if anybody ever did one, and I could never find one.
That's another book.
Yeah. The other story I'll tell came out of my very first interview with a former law partner of mine. And we were talking, and he was telling how his name is Carlos Alvarez, who lives in Tallahassee. He was telling how the family was running low on money. Their savings were running out. His father had been a lawyer in Cuba and could not practice law in this country because he didn't have a license. And so they decided they were going to open a small dress shop because his mother had been trained in the sewing arts when she was in school. She'd never done it professionally. So they were going to open a small dress shop in North Miami. And as Carlos tells the story, somebody had to take a chance, and it was two Jewish guys who gave them a break on the rent. And that was the first story that I heard about how individual Jews were befriending individual Cuban refugees, because as Carlos said, the 1940s was not that far from the 1960s. And when they saw us coming, there was something they could relate to. I heard stories like that over and over and over about individual Cuban refugees who have been befriended by individual Jews in Miami and in New York.
There's a great story along those lines in the book about Stanley Marcus. Do you want to talk about that one?
Yeah,
David Marcus Spain.
yeah, one of the women in my book had come over with her twin sister, and their father's best friend in Havana had been the owner of the premier department store in downtown Havana. And he wrote a letter of introduction for them to Stanley Marcus, who at that time was running Neiman Marcus in downtown Dallas. And so they went and they introduced themselves, they produced the letter, and they ended up getting jobs. And one of them got a job at the gift card desk, and the other one got a job selling men's furnishings, ties, shirts, all of that sort of thing. So it was very common, those stories that I kept coming across as I was doing the book. In the interviews.
That story is really great because apparently she was a nervous wreck. She was very young, by herself, didn't have her parents. She's being interviewed by Stanley Marcus. She was totally intimidated. And he asked what her experience was. And she said, well, I have had 1 year of fashion design. And he says to her, would you like to be in that department? And to her immortal regret, she said no. And she said, I should have said yes, because then she would have been in the fashion design department at Neiman Marcus, which would have been
Yeah.
pretty cool.
That's right.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about your relationships with your narrators. Have you become good friends with some of these people?
I have, it's almost like a little community. One of the first things that I did after I really had maybe a half a dozen or a dozen interviews under my belt was, my wife said, you ought to stay in touch with these people. You ought to be emailing them periodically about your progress on the project. And so I did. As I interviewed people, I added them to my narrator's email list, and every 6 months or so, I would send them a progress report and tell them about, what I was doing, what the prospects were, where I was. And I kept hearing back over and over, oh, we're so excited about this. We can't wait to read the book. And, quite a few of them, like Jose, when I come to town, they show up.
Which is really great. I want to know if any of the narrators gave you any ideas or other leads. For instance, when you interviewed one narrator, did they suggest another?
Yeah, quite a few actually, because one of the things I usually ask was, anyone you can suggest that I ought to interview for the book. You know what I'm doing. You have a real sense of what this project is about. Any suggestions? And quite a few of them did. Jose gave me a lead on somebody here in Tampa that's also in the book. And I had people who recommended all kinds of other Cuban Americans for me to talk to.
I talked to David a little bit before we started, and I asked him if there were many people who he had approached who turned down his request to interview. Do you want to share?
There were not many. I would say probably 80% of the people I asked for an interview readily agreed. And I was initially surprised by that. But what I came to believe was that the people I was asking to tell their stories wanted to tell their stories. They wanted their stories remembered. And in many cases, I think it was because they wanted to honor the memory of people, usually parents, but also family, friends, and others who made it possible for them to be in this country as opposed to Cuba. That was certainly the case with Jose. So I think for a lot of them, the opportunity to tell their story was a way to honor parents, and for many of them, it was just a catharsis.
Now I want to know if you've ever been to Cuba.
I was there in April for the first time. I had wanted to go for many years, and the stars came into alignment in the spring, and I went down for a week in April and had a wonderful experience. Just really enjoyed the people, enjoyed seeing all the places that people in interviews and told me about. It was really a great experience.
Yes, and for those of you who haven't seen the book, he has a map and he marks locations that he talks about. So I think a lot of us who've lived in Florida our entire lives think we know this story really well. And so I want to ask you, how on a scale of like 1 to 10, you thought maybe going into this project, you knew the story, how would you rate that after you had all of these interviews?
I thought I knew the story when I started. What I discovered as I went along, both in terms of doing the readings that I did and in terms of interviewing the people that I interviewed, I came to the conclusion I knew maybe 10% of the story. And some of the things that I knew turned out not to be accurate, turned out not to be true. So it was a great voyage of discovery for me, if you will. I learned so much more than I thought I would learn. I thought I was going to be collecting stories, and in fact, I was learning as I was going along.
I think it's a fun presentation though, because this book does not read like a textbook. You don't feel like you're being talked to. It really is a compilation of these wonderful, warm, heartwarming stories. We're just really quite heart-wrenching. At the beginning, there's a lot of, I would say, sadness, but then at the end, it really is a story of great hope. It's a wonderful story of amazing people, and actually, it's really a good story about our state and our nation.
I think that's absolutely true. I have come to the conclusion that you can't really understand Florida if you don't understand the story of the Cuban exiles who came over in those first 15 years after Castro took power, because they laid the foundation for the Cuban American community that has been so important for our state and for the country.
I completely agree. So, you know, you used to be a lawyer. I have to ask, is this particular book a passion project, or is it launched a new career? Is another book in the works? What can you tell us about that?
It probably is closest description would be as a passion project. I wanted to write a book for many, many years, ever since I was in graduate school. And it come close once or twice, but I realized when the idea for this came along, at the age I was at, I wasn't going to have many more second or third chances. So figured I better take advantage of this idea and do it. And so that's how I came to do it.
Well, I also would like for you to go into a little bit of detail about your preparation of, you know, you really did some serious preparation in learning about how oral histories are retold. And so you might share with the audience about that.
Well, I did obviously get a lot of reading about Cuba and Cuban history from the period in question, as well as, earlier parts of the Cuban history. But I also had to learn the ins and the outs of doing oral history. I've been a fan of oral history for many, many years, ever since I was in graduate school. Some of my favorite books, oral histories, The Good War by Studs Terquin, about the American experience in World War II. My Soul is Rested by Howell Raines, about the Civil Rights Movement in the Deep South. I mean, these oral history books really take you down and deep into the historical experience and let you understand what it was like for the people who lived it. Because we often forget that history is lived by people like us. So I took a number of online courses in the discipline of oral history, the practical aspects of it, the ethics of it, and exactly what an oral historian does. And so I did that, and then I just went out and put it into practice.
Which is really great. Didn't you go back to your alma mater? Is that not right? You took a class maybe at Columbia, is that right?
No, I took one online from Baylor University in Texas, which has one of the most well-regarded oral history programs in the country. They do workshops online every year, in which they teach people how to do this. And a lot of people around the country are engaging in oral history projects in their communities about the history of the places where they live.
So I have to ask you another question, since you had a career as a journalist. In this book, David will give introductory material at the beginning of each chapter, and sometimes segueing from one slight nuance of a story to another. It's really quite interesting. He does these very nice transitions that I think he does a really good job. But there are many occasions in which he talks about the role that the United States media played in the whole Cuban story. And as a former journalist, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's been a mixed bag. The whole history between our country and Cuba is very complicated on many different levels. And that goes back really to the 19th century. But I think the media's role in this has been a mixed bag.
Right, yes. Sometimes, so how, if you would grade the U.S. media's coverage of what's transpired in the pages of your book, what grade would you give them from, how would you rate the accuracy of the reporting?
Well, I don't think of it in terms of the accuracy as much as I do the depth. And I think that's the real fault that I see in much of the coverage that in the past has been provided about Cuba in particular, and presently is being provided. And I think it's pretty superficial. I don't think there's as much depth as we would need in order to have a much better understanding of conditions in that country.
Well, I personally would recommend that everyone turn to the last paragraph of his book. Is that terrible? Is that a spoiler? Do you mind if we have you read that? Is that too much to ask? I mean, the very, very last paragraph, I think you.
The last paragraph of the epilogue.
Yes, of the epilogue. Yeah, I think that's really super. Page 257.
Yeah, got it. This is the history, and these are the memories, these and many others that they carry with them all these years later, of a home they left temporarily, but ultimately forever, of sadness and regret, but also gratitude and hope, of lives from a different time and place left behind, and of lives created in a new home 90 miles and a lifetime away.
Just sums it up really well. He says earlier in that the goal of his book was to preserve the story of the 600,000 Cubans who came to the United States from 1959 to 1973. And I think his goal was accomplished. I think he did a great job. I really highly recommend the book. I think it's a lot of fun. It's easy to read. It's very accessible. And it would make a wonderful gift, but I think it's really important. I really think this is the kind of book that should be in everyone's library. And of course, it is already in the library at Florida House, DC. And so if you go to Washington, DC, you can see it. We are featuring 4 books a year. And this is our last book that we're featuring in 2022. I think we want to open this up for questions at this time, if that's all right. I don't know if anyone has a question, maybe you can come up and use my microphone.
Well, can I just suggest that we start by asking Jose if there's anything he wants to add?
Jose, why don't you come up and take my place if you'd like?
Anything you want to add, Jose?
We would love to hear from you.
You knew I was going to put you on this.
Well, thank you, David, for doing this. Being in this book was a great experience. He thoroughly interviewed all of us for 2 hours, at least 2 hours. And it was a privilege to be able to share our story with him. Every story that he put in the book are true stories. We came here, we left Cuba penniless. We arrived here and we were welcomed with open arms. It was a great country. And it was a new beginning for us, filled with hope and freedom. Something that we didn't have in Cuba, and there was nothing to look forward to in Cuba. I think my parents every day making the decision, the courage that they had to make a decision to leave Cuba for us. They did that for my sister and me. I have family left in Cuba, and I know what they're going through now. Cuba right now is pure misery, and so I think my parents every day for making the tough decision to get us out of there. And I appreciate David taking the time to write it and put it there perfectly.
Thank you. Another one of my narrators is here tonight, Ralph Hernandez, who I didn't recognize outside of his coat and tie. Ralph, anything you want to add? Anything you want to mention?
And I do want to correct something. He said that he wrote or emailed and kept everybody abreast. I don't remember getting any emails, but then again, I don't read many of them, and I do receive. And I'm glad he didn't read one that I said that said, hey, stop everything. I got to check this out because of the language that I may have used. So if the University of Miami is going to generate something that is exactly what I said, then I think we're going to be in a little bit of trouble, both David and I. This was a great experience. I know just last Saturday, we had the misfortune of celebrating my father-in-law's 100th birthday. It was a real misfortune. I've been hoping otherwise for many years. But at the function at my house, Elliot Mueller, my wife's cousin, was there, and he started reading a chapter, and he said, this is the first time that an egocentric maniac like you doesn't talk about himself from the inception. And I talked about my wife, Becky, who was in the book, supposedly the princess from Philadelphia. She's still here with us today and will always be by my side, I certainly hope. This was a wonderful idea. In retrospect, I'm glad I spent the time and that I said yes, despite the fact that I had to get a call from an appellate judge, in essence, reminding me that the success of many of my cases in the future depended upon my spending a couple of hours with his friends. Another, and the final thing I'll say, because I could go on for hours as usual, but, again, I haven't, we'll be picking up couple copies here, perhaps others to send to our daughters and stuff in the Northeast. But I grew up, and I remember vividly, there were three brothers, Caesar, Arturo, and Carlos Alvarez. And they, and in Cuba, we, I would always, I never liked Carlos that much. I looked up to Arturo, who was like the best at everything. And that's what I wanted to be like. Of course, I never achieved that, but Carlos did. And I haven't talked to him or seen him. And I've seen a lot of people from the past over all these years, but I do intend to follow up, use the excuse that, that David invited the conversation and tell him that he turned out quite all right in life. And that, I still wonder about what happened way back when they came to my house and stole my bag and glove.
So in the book, I will tell you, David he interviews Carlos. Carlos says he loved baseball.
Okay.
He really wasn't interested in football. Football wasn't his sport, but in the United States, he had to do a rotation. He had to play all sports, and then he found out, he was the fastest guy. And I think he tells the story, David, and first time he plays in a football game, he gets the ball and he makes an immediate touchdown. He said he was sold.
Yeah, it was Pee Wee football.
Yes.
I thought his stories about Pee Wee football were much more interesting than anything he would say about playing as a Gator. Because it tells you where he came from and how he got to be who he was.
Well, he also talks about how he was getting these scholarships. He had no idea that you could get a free ride to college through a scholarship for playing football. He did know, though, that football was the American sport, and since it was the American sport, by golly, he wanted to play it because he wanted to be an American. But all these different schools, I think Vanderbilt was the first one that gave him an offer, and I will have to say, even though he lives in Tallahassee, FSU did not give him an offer, no scholarship offer. They thought his ankle might not be his knee, so he had a basketball knee, and so that was sort of the loss of FSU, right? The rest is history.
Let me ask, since I really can't see all that well from here, but is there anybody else, any of my other narrators who are here tonight? Because I want to give every one of them a chance to exact their revenge. I guess not. I guess it's just Jose and Ralph.
Are there any other questions that anyone wants to ask? Oh, okay, yes.
So first of all, I want to say thank you so much for telling your stories.
Thank you.
Okay, talking about 1961, figure and we were one of the first families, so we were kind of a clearinghouse. All the families coming through, Texas, Philadelphia. So when you talk about some of the early violence that falls into the clearinghouse, everybody coming through. Well, we had that experience, but we got to hear all this. We love hearing all these stories. So even though I wasn't a narrator, well, you're narrating. It was an experience of refreshing all the stories. And I want to comment is that you have 54 narrators, and I think you have half a dozen narrators. So you were developing a lot of characters throughout the book, and it was sliced in around topics where you did family. It was probably all the time, but you were able to handle it because it was a different eras. I thought that was kind of fascinating. Thank you very much for doing that.
Well, thank you for those comments. He mentioned, for those who couldn't have heard his comment, one thing he mentioned was that when his family came here very early on, their home was a clearinghouse where subsequent arrivals would come stay with them. They would hear stories about what was happening in Cuba. That was a very common experience among exile families. Not only putting up friends that were coming, but in some cases doubling up and sharing a house or an apartment together. And the other comment this gentleman made was, he talked about the fact that so many of the narrators in the book, I think because of the experiences they went through in life, you can see them evolve as they grow and change. And that was certainly true of many of the ones who are in the book. So thank you.
I thought it was interesting that the children who came first before their parents would become acclimated, and then their parents would come over, and the children were sort of ahead of them that way, which is very interesting.
Well, we haven't talked about it, but one of the best remembered stories from that whole period was Operation Pedro Pan. 14,000 unaccompanied Cuban children who were brought here by the Catholic Church and the United States government surreptitiously. This was the first time when President Kennedy decided to finance the care for these unaccompanied children. It was the first time that our government had ever assumed responsibility for the care of refugee children who were unaccompanied when they got to our border. And that's still something that our government does. So that was one of the things that came out of the whole Pedro Pan experience that I thought was really quite interesting.
I think so too. Are there any other questions? Anyone wants to make a remark?
What's your next book?
I don't have one in mind, Francisco. I'm still debating that. I'm still trying to sell this one. I'm just mercenary enough to focus on that.
Oh, that's right. It was great. It was published by the University of Florida Press. That was another good story too, which you could even elaborate on if you wanted to.
Well, I just had the best experience at the University of Florida Press. It's an imprint of the University Press of Florida, which is a consortium that represents all of our state universities. But I ended up there, and when I started the project, I thought the odds that I would ever get the book published were very small, because I had none of the conventional credentials to write this book. But I figured if I did the work, that somebody would take notice and that would make a difference. And at UF it did. And so I had a fabulous editor. She worked with me for 2 years, and after I turned in the final manuscript, she sent it out to 3 outside scholars who had all written and published on Cuba and Cuban history. They critiqued the manuscript. They had great suggestions. Then they reviewed it a second time. So it really went through a lot of hands, but also a lot of expert hands who helped to make it much better than it would have been if it was just me.
Well, I think this really brings our program close to a close. I just want to thank you all for coming tonight. I'm glad that you are participating here at the Oxford Exchange. It's the most glorious spot. David Powell's done a wonderful job. Florida House is really terrific. We should be proud as Floridians. We're the only state that has an embassy in DC. And if you are in the nation's capital, be sure to come by and get a glass of that orange juice and think about those refugee children who were so delighted on an Operation Pedro Pan to be served a glass of orange juice because they hadn't had it in years. It was such a treat. So every time you go to Florida House, have a glass of orange juice. Do a little toast here. Also, we have a wonderful art exhibit going on right now at the House of Florida Highwaymen. There's always something really fun to see and do at Florida House in DC. And it is a hospitality center for all Floridians. We're a ray of sunshine in the nation's capital. And so I hope you'll come see us. Thanks so much for supporting us. We have bookmarks on the table out front that talk about the 4 books that we're going to highlight next year. We do it 4 times a year, Zoom and in person. We hope some of them will be in person like this evening. And the next book club actually is going to be a lot of fun. It'll be on December 1st at 5:30. And we're featuring 3 booksellers from around the state who are going to talk to us about great Florida books that might be good for gift giving. We're starting with Midtown Reader in Tallahassee, and then we're going to Writer's Block in Winter Park, and then we'll end with Books and Books Key West. And it'll be a lot of fun. Each of the booksellers is going to highlight 10 books, and we're doing it on the 1st because it's Ria Child's birthday. And Ria Child is the person who came up with the whole idea of Florida House. So we're going to say happy birthday to Ria, and then we're going to talk about books to shop on December 1st. But thank you again to the Oxford Exchange and Laura Taylor for all that you did this evening. And this was a lot of fun, and we hope to come back soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Thanks for all of you for being here.
It's really fun.